Hi, I want to just welcome everybody and just sort of say a few remarks before we get going here. I'm Lisa Sewell, and I teach in the English department, and I co-teach with Alan Drew a course that runs in conjunction with this reading series. Alan is the director of the Literary Festival and is responsible for having put the whole event together. I'm just sort of a sidekick here, but I agree to do the welcome for the poets. So there are a number of people that need to be thanked for their contributions to this literary festival. This is our penultimate reading. We have one more reading scheduled on April 12th. John Haskell will be reading in the De Leon room in SAC in room 300, so not in this room or in the Radnor St. David's room. But lots of people have helped make this literary festival possible. I want to thank the various departments and programs that have contributed, including the College of Arts and Sciences, the English department and the chair, Evan Radcliffe, the Irish Studies program, Africana Studies, the Romance Language department, Falvey Library, the Writing Center, and Gender and Women Studies, which I'm the co-director of, so I'm thanking myself here. I also want to thank graduate assistants, Afton Woodward and Karen Garvin, who've helped us with all the advertising and all the different aspects of it. And I also just want to take the opportunity to thank the class that Alan and I have been teaching, because I think you've been great hosts to our visiting writers when they come to class. So I just want to give the class a little hand for being so gracious. I want to announce a couple of other readings that are poetry readings that will be happening in the next month or so. One is coming up next week, next Thursday, March 31st. The Heimbold Chair in Irish Studies, Moya Cannon, will be reading at 6 p.m. in the President's Lounge. I hope you'll all come to that. And we have one other reading on April 13th at 4 or 4:30 p.m., we don't know for sure, in the library. Joseph Lennon from the English department and the director of Irish Studies, Natalie Anderson, who teaches at Swarthmore College, will be here, and Mary O'Malley Madec, who runs the Galway program, I think. So the three of them are going to be reading from new books on the 13th in the library at 4 or 4:30 p.m. I am just really excited to have Eleanor Wilner here to read. She's a poet whose work I've admired for a long time, and I've wanted to have her come to Villanova since I've been here. She lives in Philadelphia, so she's sort of a local treasure as well as a national treasure, perhaps. But I'm really excited to have her. We have two students from the class who are going to introduce her, Megan Mikorsky and Kara Scannell. So I'm going to turn the podium over to them.
This evening we are pleased to welcome award-winning poet Eleanor Wilner. Born in Ohio in 1937, Wilner grew up in the turbulent years of World War II, which had a strong impact on the person she became and the poetry she would eventually write. The two most important moments of my childhood were not individual but cultural, she says, the moments when my life intersected with events that affected most human beings, the opening of the concentration camps and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These childhood horrors translated into a vigorous anti-war fervor that has become one of the most common themes of her poetry. Wilner received her bachelor's degree from Goucher College and a master's and PhD from Johns Hopkins University. She went on to work as a journalist for the Baltimore News Reporter, a feature writer for the WFBR radio in Baltimore, a consultant for the Maryland State Commission on the Aging, and an instructor of English at Morehead State University. She has taught most recently at the University of Chicago, Northwestern, and Smith College. She is currently on the faculty of the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. Now considered one of the most accomplished poets currently on the scene, Wilner actually did not publish her first book of poetry until the age of 42. Wilner was also heavily involved in the civil rights movement and was even present for Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. After King's assassination, she took time off from her PhD program to become press secretary to Perrin Mitchell, the first African-American congressman to be elected in the state of Maryland. She remembers his election with the same jubilation that she experienced when President Obama was elected almost 40 years later. A passionate advocate of social justice, Wilner demonstrates to political science majors like myself that you do not need to become a politician to affect change. Even now, her poetry continues to strive for peace and equality in a society where such critical values are often lost in the chaos of bipartisan politics.
Since publishing her first book of poetry, Maya, at the age of 42, she has received numerous awards, including fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. She is also the author of Shekinah, Sarah's Choice, Otherwise, Processional, Reversing the Spell, The Girls with Bees in Her Hair, and 2010's Tourist in Hell. As quoted in the New York Times Book Review, one reviewer of Reversing the Spell, her book of selected poems, said, "She is attempting to rewrite Western myth and biblical tradition and drives straight into the oncoming headlights. Her sudden flights of lyricism are disarming and dazzling. Critics acclaim her ability to eloquently write the unsung tale in mythical and biblical stories. Her work flows fluidly into my mind, bringing with it riveting thoughts of these shadows from myth and history, having the spotlight thrust upon them once again. With bold imagery and silky flow, she transports the reader into her world head-on. Poems like Sarah's Choice and Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm have rang in my ears. The beautiful words intertwined with the controversial implications are the perfect complement to each other. To quote the praise of Susan Spencer, Wilner is a poet of incomparable erudition and a gift of insight. There is no other contemporary poet who has addressed, as she has throughout her distinguished career, the world legacy of history and myth with such a keen sense of wonder, curiosity, and in the end, literal revision. Tourist in Hell furthers Wilner's reputation as a great poet of the invisible, the forgotten, and the potential. It is my absolute honor and a pleasure to welcome Eleanor Wilner to Villanova.
Thank you. I feel like I'm ascending to Parnassus here or something. Thank you, Kara and Megan, for those amazing introductions. Destined to disappoint, I fear, after such eloquence. It's really good to be here, and thank you all for coming out, and thanks to my gracious hosts, Lisa Sewell and Alan Drew. I have a little script, because I'm kind of a loose assortment of digressions which are lightly held together by memory and hope. So I need a script to stay honest here. Since it's trying to be spring out there, I would like to break the ice in here with a poem. It's so, oh my. I was sitting in the front row and all you can see is the head. And it's kind of like the worst part of television, you know, the talking head. Do they have bodies? And if so, what would they be like? Breaking the Ice. This is a poem about that seasonal effort at starting over. This poem was born from a phone call one morning from my friend Marcia. "Hello," she said, just like that. "I feel bad. I feel like everything is ending. Please, for God's sake, tell me everything is starting." This is the kind of phone calls I get. So this poem, which is called Yes, Everything is Starting, was born of a deliberate dare to be cheerful. A couple of notes on this. The poem opens down SEPTA's R5 line in Center City, Philadelphia, and it moves out from there, about as far out as it goes, or as far out as we know it goes. And you know, the further out you look in the universe, the farther back you're looking in time. until at the very furthest edge you see what the poem calls the red edge of creation. And that refers to the infrared waves from the explosion 13 billion years ago that gave us our universe, and which the scientists so unpoetically call the Big Bang. The other heavenly light in the poem refers to that great image from Dante's Paradiso, this immense rose made entirely of light. The blessed souls are like bees flying in and out of its luminous petals. It takes a lot of water to keep me going this morning. It's always a question whether I will drown or finish the reading first. Everything is starting. The snow is filthy now. It has been drinking oil and soot and car exhaust for days, and dogs have marked it with their special brand of brilliant yellow piss. For a week after it fell, the snow stood in frozen horror at the icy chill and hardened on the top, and then today, the thaw. Now everything is starting up again. The traffic flows. The place where dogs pause and sniff becomes once more invisible to us, and in the gutters of our streets, a minor Nile floods from the old drifts into the gasping drains. Even the sewers are jubilant in the rush that foretells spring. The rats dance along the pipes. On all the trees, the buds push against the sealed bark, as if against the tight containment of the past. While deep in the Florida Keys, along some slow canal, the manatees roll heavily in the dark stream, the way that sleepers slowly turn and dream, and the cranes look up unrolling their long necks, possessed by restlessness just before they fly. Light years away, beyond the veils of the Milky Way, out at the red edge of creation, where everything is always starting. There, a memory shifts and gathers itself once more. A memory of the time, if time it can be called, when all that is the matter, or all that matter is drawn into one place, as if into a single thought, and unimaginable, ignites, shattering the ageless night in which the cosmos only dreamed, and in the oldest memory of which I think we have a share. It was an endlessly unfolding flower of fire, the rose of light that Dante saw, its afterimage in the soul. And from that flower, the seeds of all the galaxies were sown. Now, in our own, the snow recedes. The buds will shatter the end of every twig as everything is starting up again. The crocus pokes its purple furled above the thawing ground. And when the local ember of that first fiery bloom, our sun, touches its silk with light, it will unfurl in perfect silence. Unlike us, jubilant and noisy who never were the point, but still delight in being the sole narrators, upstarts of the dawn. And speaking of starting, a brief return here to Genesis, the biblical myth of origins, which tells us nothing about our origins as a species, but a whole lot about the people who wrote the stories. We live a long way from them, but still, Eve's appetite for knowledge persists. If I've conflated her with Persephone by giving her a pomegranate to eat, well, why the hell not? After all, there never were apples in the Middle East. Huh? As the poem's title says, the apple was a northern invention. When she ate the pomegranate, it was as if every seed, with its wet, red, shining coat of sweet flesh clinging to the dark core was one of nature's eyes. Afterward, it was nature that was blind, and she, who was wild with vision, condemned to see what was before her and behind. And this is another poem that dramatizes the downside of this human assignment of being nature's eyes. This one does it by asking a question: what if the bee had to see what we see? What then? Field of vision. And if the bee, half drunk on the nectar of the columbine, could think of the dying queen, the buzz of chaos in the hive, the agitation of the workers in their cells, the veiled figure come again to rob the combs, then would the summer fields grow still, the hum of propagation cease, the flowers spread bright petals to no avail. As if a plug were drawn from a socket in the sun, the light that flowed into the growing field would fail. For how should the bee make honey then? Afraid to look away. While we're into bees, the title poem from this book, The Girl with Bees in Her Hair. This image was an orphan. It had no context. In fact, it had no connection to anything. It was just there, and it wouldn't leave me alone. So I wrote it down and watched to see what would happen. And the dispossessed came calling. The girl with bees in her hair came in an envelope with no return address. She was small, wore a wrinkled dress of figured cotton full from neck to ankles, with a button of bone at the throat, a collar of torn lace. She was standing before a monumental house, on the scale you see in certain English films, urns, curved-dried stone lions in an entrance far too vast for any home. She was not of that place, for she had a foreign look, and tangled black hair, and an icon heavy and strange, dangling from an oversized chain around her neck that looked as if some tall adult had taken it from his and hung it there as a charm to keep her safe from a world of infinite harm that soon would take him far from her and leave her standing as she stood now, barefoot, gazing without expression into distance, away from the grandeur of that house, its gravel walks and sculpted gardens. She carried a basket full of flames, but whether fire or flowers with crimson petals shading toward a central gold was hard to say, though certainly it burned, and the light within it had nowhere else to go, and so fed on itself, intensified its red and burning glow, the only color in the scene. The rest was done in grays, light and shadow, as they played along her dress, across her face, and through her midnight hair, lively with bees. At first, they seemed just errant bits of shade, until the humming grew too loud to be denied, as the bees flew in and out, as if choreographed in a country dance between the fields of sun and the black tangle of her hair. Without warning, a window on one of the upper floors flew open. Wind had caught the casement, a silken length of curtain filled like a billowing sail. The bees began to stream out from her hair, straight to the single opening in the high facade. Inside, a moment later, the sound of screams. The girl, who had through all of this seemed unconcerned and blank, all at once looked up. She shook her head, her mane of hair freed of its burden of bees, and walked away, out of the picture frame, far beyond the confines of the envelope that brought her image here, here where the days grow longer now. The air begins to warm, dread grows to fear among us, and the bees swarm. That was the good news. I'm going to read you a few poems from my new book called Tourist in Hell. And this is Porcellino. He is the wild boar in the marketplace of Florence, whose nose, as you see, is the touchstone of tourists. I think of this figure secretly as free market forces. Greed, rapacity, ferocity, cupidity, just about every itty maybe except pity, of course. Just to clarify the hell of the title. The epigraph for the book comes from a poem by Hayden Carruth, whose setting is hell, and whose speaker is Timur the Lame, who brags that he killed 300,000 people in his time, probably more. He says he did his best. He opens my book with these words. Welcome, we're waiting for you, pretty lady. What do you think hell is if it isn't history? Two poems I'll read you from this book. Most of these poems were written during the 8 years of Bush and Cheney. So I'm sorry to say that they're what I guess you might call bummer lit. This one was written in the waning days of the Bush administration, the year 2006, the 5th year of the Iraq War, and just an ordinary Saturday night in the American desert. Moonlit rocks, sand, and a web of shadows thrown over the world from the cottonwoods, the Manzanita, the Ocotillo. It is the hour of the tarantula, arising as predictable as tide, irritable as moon drag. And if this were an SF film, the spider would be huge as a water tank. It would loom red-eyed and horrible, its mandibles wet with drool or blood, and screams would be heard as it stumbled through the cactus and the brush, trees upended, small bodies crunching in its path. In the distance, police cars, lights flashing, sirens blaring would be tearing down the highways, dust rising in their wake, and cars would begin streaming from the distant cities, the terror growing with each report of it. The creature, like a figure from the bad conscience of the race, hungry, hairy, would be coming for every blonde, she hiding in a million bedrooms, breasts heaving under filmy white lace. But now, as the film runs down, in a rush of stale air, the hydraulic spider deflates. The saline leaks from the implants of the bedroom blonde. The moon's projection clicks off, and the night is as it was, a place where fear takes its many forms, and the warships gather in a distant gulf, where a small man with more arms than a Hindu god has set a desert alight, and grief blooms. While here, the theaters are full of horror on the screen, and you can hear over the sinister canned music, the chainsaws and the screams, the sound of coke sucked up through straws, your own jaws moving as you chew. Many of these poems are necessarily a meditation on the waste of war, its mindless repetitions. This was a topic I didn't choose. It was one that history did. A quote from Hegel opens this first section of the book. Man learns from history that man learns nothing from history. This poem is called In a Time of War. A time which seems to have become perpetual. You know, how do we imagine the casualties? They are beyond reckoning. There's a line of Richard Wilbur's, quote, "Spare us the long numbers that rocket the mind. Our slow, unreckoning hearts will be left behind." In a time of war, flies caught in the sap of the living tree someday will be precious, dressed in amber. Just so the past appears to the present, gem-like in its perfect preservation. The hardened gold of yesterday, a relic through which today's sun shines. But those who are caught in the sticky sap of actual time, insects in the odds against them, who struggle in the ooze, slowly sink into the mass, the numberless anonymous dead, till the atrocious becomes the mundane, our senses numb from the sheer litany of repetition. Let us then just watch this one small, desperate fly, stuck first by the feet, and then in its struggles entangled entirely in the glob of sap, its wings heavy as a brass angel's, until it is all at once still, a dark speck in a bubble of sap oozing from the felled tree in a forest marked for the mill. How many millennia will pass before a teardrop lavalier of amber carrying its cargo of loss will adorn the vanity of another creature, the fly, a fossil of a species no longer present on the earth itself a speck in a cosmos where galaxies are carded like cotton on a comb and pulled out into a distance where some new fabric is being spun and shimmers in the firelight of countless burning suns. There was a warning, you know, buyer beware. This is a poem I often read, and today I have to read it, I feel. I think here about Muriel Rukeyser's lines. I was born in the first century of world wars. Most days I was more or less insane. I was a child during World War I, as you were told, Megan. So when in the mid-1980s I was to spend 2 years living and teaching in Japan, my friend Mark Galicchio out there, I found myself strangely terrified. And I couldn't figure that out until suddenly I realized that these were people that I had been taught programmatically to fear and hate. They weren't people, you know. They weren't human like us. They were just the enemy. And since then, nothing has really changed except the name of the enemy. Of course, I came to love that precious island and its people, and have been watching horrified with the rest of the world the heart-scalding images of the vast destruction there from the earthquake and the tsunami, and feeling too the awful ironies of the threat of radiation from those damaged nuclear power plants, recalling the devastation of the atom bombs that our nation dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I want to read 2 poems that I wrote after my time there, both of which record my respect for these remarkable people and the humanization of the emblem for their nation, that red sun on a white field, the Japanese flag. You will notice that this poem goes around in circles. I do that on purpose to suggest the circumlocution of the Japanese. They have a tendency to talk around and around the subject until you begin to intuit what it is that's not being said, which is the point. And in this poem, talking around becomes a kind of walking around, as two figures are seen walking around the path. It's all coming back to me. That surrounds the moat, that circles the grounds, that surrounds the palace of the emperor that sits in the center of Tokyo. If you don't know, I should tell you that the Japanese measure time by dynasties. This was Showa 62, meaning this was the 62nd year of the reign of the Showa emperor, who had been, of course, the emperor all through the war, and was then in his 80s, and is the emperor of this poem. Ume, plum. Or sake. The fruit is small and often served shriveled, soaked in some attar or other, an odd shade of red weak and toward the blue. Sometimes one of these unpromising tiny plums is set in the center of a flat bed of white rice to mime the nation's flag, red sun on a white field. Those years ago we never knew, kept ignorant of all that might disable war, that the flag with the wide red rays that rose over the bodies adorned the Zero's wings was a war flag, emblem of a burning sun, like rage, or whatever it is that sets men's lives at naught and pours them young and hot down history's drain. The trees here must be bred for the beauty of their flower, for the plums are sour, the cherries small and bitter. But oh, the ume blooming in the early spring, the sakura unfolding in a brilliant sky, blossoms borrowing the light for shelter, a glowing parasol of pink and white, or the world a child's globe that sits in the Buddha's hand, and when he laughs it shakes until the air is filled with silken snow, the wind toying with it, lifting the petals as if back to the branch, then bringing them lightly down. Walking the shimmering tunnel of flowering trees along the imperial moat. Mrs. Nakano and I spoke of the war when we were both children, the same age, I think, though it was a point of pride with her to never say. Her voice was matter of fact, or else it was the way English goes flat in a mouth made for another tongue. In Kobe, she had crouched with her mother in the bomb shelter while our planes bombed her city flat. The trees shivered a little. The delicate arbor sent down a shower of petals to our feet. The carp, grown huge, slid by in the moat, and the rain began, steady. We opened our umbrellas as we went. She spoke then about her husband, her misery with him, his anger, and his mother. The doors that one by one she tried and found them locked. How do we keep from going mad? I thought, looking at the trees, bred for their beauty by an aesthetic breed of men, who wanted a woman wrapped in tissue-thin silk, her mouth a hole with blackened teeth, who would dive at the dark stack of a ship to a fiery death. And saw with them our own young men, the same, filing into the black belly of a huge cargo plane, each with a woman in his wallet, her words on lilac paper, her distant image as his aphrodisiac inhale. I tried to ask the question that can't be asked in words, having no subject and no predicate, but death. I thought of the bombs falling, and then my mind went blank as the radar screen when the thing that moves into its range is much too close or gone. And Mrs. Nakano and I, the fortunate ones, walked side by side beneath the cherry trees and watched the great smoking craters of memory fill in and disappear, and watched the rain turn the fallen petals into a sticky debris, and walked because we were alive, and walked to keep from going mad, and walked for beauty and for company, the whole perimeter of the emperor's moat. That carp-infested fence around the palace, walled in, where power keeps its face, and ends, as history ends, in Lear, King Lear, old, heart-sore, the dead Cordelia in his arms. Reverse Pieta, a motherless world, the father holding the sacrificed child, on a ground of fallen petals, wet with rain, plumb on a field of white. But here, we break the circle, cross the street, and bow. We part, Mrs. Nakano and I go, each to her own gate. This poem I've never read aloud. In this one, the little girl in the red snowsuit, seen through the bird's eyes on a field of snow, is another and very different and entirely unintentional version of the humanization of the Japanese flag. This is not strong emotion, this is simply a leaking valve. Kazuko was a student of mine in Tokyo, and she told me of a vision experience she had when she was, I think, about 3 years old, but she had never forgotten it. When she entered this kind of timeless space during a snowstorm that poets call the lyric moment. So this poem attempts to recreate Kazuko's vision. So to create the imaginative space for this, just please try to imagine yourselves inside of a huge snow globe which has just been shaken. In the blizzard's heart, a little girl lies stretched out on the snow, watching the sky repeat itself in white, each flake a petal from a cherry tree, heaven's sakura, the great tree larger than the compass of the eye. The snowflakes blur, obscure the bridge that Hiroshige veiled with bits of white. The same snow falls tonight. For time, our little history is small as the holes a pin makes in a shoji screen, has broken loose, and floating on the breeze's back drifts in the swing of cool black air, night's loosened hair, whose sheen is like the sea on a night when the moon is full, its glitter scattered on black waves. Just so, the snow, as it spills from space, floats easily. The way birds ride the wind, look down and see one small figure in a red snowsuit floating in a field of white. And looking up, laughing as the snowflakes fill her eyes, her mind, the sky, until it's all one thing, sky, self, and snow, a host of almost same, untied, afloat together in a dance of wind and breath. So, one by one, things fade into each other, and the snow makes night a weightless space, where centuries lightly pass, vanishing like snowflakes falling on the ocean's overflowing glass. I'm going to close with two poems. You need to tell people that there's only two more. Just, it gives you hope, you know? This poem tells a true story. It's the story of the day that, it's a famous story, in fact, I'm sure you know it. The day that Annie Sullivan spilled water into one of Helen Keller's hands and spilled water into the other. And it's very much my idea of what language is for. And what happens in the little house afterwards is also accurate. I need to tell you that because I lie a lot in these poems. If this poem had an epigraph, it would be Theodore Roethke's line, "In a dark time, the eye begins to see." Of a son she can remember. I might tell you that this was written in a poem chain, and a woman sent me the poem, and I had to take her last line and make it a title. And her last line was, "Of a son she can remember," and that gave me the poem. So there literally was one woman putting words into another that brought this poem into being. After they had been in the woods, after the living tongue woke Helen's hand afterwards, they went back to the little house of exile, Annie and Helen, who had lived in the silent dark like a bat without radar in the back of a cave. And she picked up the broken doll she had dismembered that morning in her rage, and limb by limb, her agile fingers moving with their fine intelligence over each part, she remembered the little figure of the human. And though she was inside now, and it was still dark, she remembered the missing sun with a slow wash of warmth on her shoulders, on her back, as when you step shivering out of a dank shade into the sun's sudden balm. And as the warmth spread, it felt like the other side of water. And that is when she knew how light on water looks. And she put her outspread hands into the idea of it, and she lifted the lines of light, cross-hatched like a web, out of the water, and dripping, stretched the golden net of meaning in the light. So. Did any of you see that epic film, The Last Emperor, about the last emperor of China? Anybody see that? Okay, there's a great scene in there that gets into the poem. The scene where there's a procession of eunuchs leaving the palace. And then there's another reference here I want to mention to the reputed existence of a room in the Vatican where the male genitals are kept, the ones that were removed from the classical statues and replaced by plaster of Paris fig leaves. Whether this is a rumor or a fact, I have embraced it as a truth that's simply too delicious to discard. When I began this poem, all I knew was that the statues were restless. Be careful what you remember. Can you see them now, the statues? Can you see them stirring on their pedestals, trying out their stiff arms, stepping gingerly down, breaking the glass walls that encase them? At the Vatican, forcing the door of the locked room, tearing off the plaster of Paris fig leaves, rummaging about in the heaps of broken off genitals so that, when they leave God's palace of art, like the eunuchs of China's final dynasty, who left the palace for the last time, carrying in small jars the parts of themselves taken by empire, so too the statues would be whole now, heading home. They tear themselves from the fountains, leaving behind the public play of the waters, climb down from their candlelit niches, deserting their place in the great composition. They enter the long loneliness of roads, their exodus making a path from the cities, a gleaming white stream like refugees, returning to their distant burned villages, their memories a desolation of marble. Day and night they travel, some leading the horses on which they've been mounted for years in piazzas, their postures heroic. All are on foot, even the gods unaccustomed to walking, and angels from tombstones, their wings hanging useless, scholars and poets, tall women in togas, a boxer with a broken nose, a hooded woman stumbling under her son's dead weight, an armless Venus, a headless victory led by justice, the blindfold torn from her eyes. Their streams converging on the road to the mountains, they climb higher and higher, like salmon returning to the waters that spawned them. The statues, relentless, make their way to the quarries from which they were hewn, the open veins in the heart of the mountain. An avalanche heard from a distance, rumbling, thundering, or an earthquake, a war begun, or a world ending. We could only guess what we had heard. Then word spread that the statues were missing. The fountains, the squares, the galleries stood empty. The gardens were vacant, the pedestals naked, the tombstones abstract. And it is true, where the quarries had been, you can travel there and see for yourself. The mountain is whole again, the great rift closed, and young trees grow thick again on the slopes. Thank you.